Today I'm going to be testing out the Supervision watercolor tube. More specifically, I'm going to try a set called Spun Sugar. I'd never heard of this brand before, but I'm always looking out for inspiring color palettes, and I was drawn in by how soft and dreamy these paints are, so I quickly added it to my Christmas list. The Amazon listing describes these paints as high-grade gray marshmallow colors. There are 10 8ml tubes, which is a good amount of paint for the price, entirely depending on how I find the quality, I suppose. This set cost about $50 Canadian on Amazon, which comes out to about $5 per tube, which is a pretty reasonable price when compared to other watercolor brands. Something that I really appreciate is that the tubes have the transparency rating and light fastness ratings printed right on them, as well as the pigment information, so there's no need to look them up and translate online. It is too bad, however, that this information isn't available on the actual listing for the paint, as I'm sure it would actually help artists to make that purchasing decision. It seems like all of the colors have a high light fastness rating, with all 10 colors rated the same at 4 stars. I'm squeezing these tubes into my empty Paul Rubens watercolor palette. I really love how big the hollow wells are, and I can't wait to add other paints to create my own color palette. These colors have a very creamy consistency. I'll be interested in seeing how well they reactivate with water, since the way I prefer to use tube watercolors is to let them dry out. These colors aren't very transparent, which is fine with me since I tend to really glob the paint on anyway. It's almost like my Holbein acrylic gouache in terms of opacity, except this paint will reactivate. The paint also dries a bit darker on the page, much like a gouache, so I am very glad that I swatched them out first. I did a pencil drawing of a scene that was inspired by these colors, and I redrew it onto a hot press Academy watercolor pad, which is a bit more textured than a regular hot press paper. I didn't want to just trace it directly since it's really hard to recapture a loose drawing, so I just opted to use my drawing as more of an inspiration. I'm returning to the dried out paints that I squeezed out a day ago, and I'm quite pleased with the way that they reactivated. They maintained their creamy texture really nicely, although the paint when dry didn't quite stick to the palette, so unless you have a really secure tin, the dried paint blobs might get jostled around. Just keep that in mind if you're doing plein air painting, or if you're taking your supplies out and about. The paint lifts pretty well once dry, letting me touch up some areas without looking too overworked, which can be a big problem for me. This paper is pretty durable though, plus it's nice to paint on a block to avoid having the paper warp or having to tape it down. One thing that I really liked was how the paint dries. There's a nice bloom effect once the pigment hits a puddle of water. It's very watercolory, for lack of a better word. The paint also dries matte without being chalky, which I really appreciate, as opposed to my Kuretake watercolors. As with many other Japanese watercolors, they tend to dry with a bit of a sheen, as I'm sure I've mentioned in previous videos. This paint also layers very nicely. For example, for the brownish mushrooms, I allowed a layer of the peachy pink to dry first, and then I added some of the brown over top in a transparent layer. This is called glazing, and the more transparent the paint you're layering, the better it works. I wanted to keep this painting soft and loose, so rather than line with ink, I opted to use pencil crayons, and then a 6B Mars Lumograph pencil. The pencil went on nicely, especially since the paint dried smooth rather than chalky. There wasn't a dust left behind, and the paint didn't chip off like it tends to when penciling over some more budget paints, for example with the dollar store watercolors that I tested out in a previous video. I'm not used to working with such muted colors, but I have to say that it's a nice change. It feels very peaceful and relaxing. All in all, these paints feel pretty nice to paint with. So what's my final verdict on these paints? Well, I love the colors, and they were lovely to paint with, but there are two greens in the set that are quite similar. If I had to replace one of those greens, I think I'd rather have a nice buttery muted yellow as an accent color. I ended up just using a yellow pencil crayon in the painting anyway. I've seen some reviews warning that these paints are likely to fade over time, despite the high light fastness rating on the tube. I suppose we have to remember that these ratings are essentially self-reported, and only time will tell how these paints will hold up. The paints are about $5 per tube, which is the average price of a budget tube like Artist's Loft for Cotman, and I'd say that at least initially, I find the quality to be quite satisfactory. I'd recommend these paints if you appreciate experimenting with different or more limited color palettes. It's not always practical or fun to mix your own colors, especially if you just want to get right in there and paint. I'm a sucker for an aesthetic palette, and if you've already got a basic set of colors for mixing, you can make pastel colors easily by investing in a tube of white gouache, but I really do love having some colors pre-mixed and ready to use, especially when inspiration strikes. That being said, you could certainly put together your own paint color palettes or mix and match tubes for a similar price. I'll definitely incorporate some of these colors into my artwork going forward, specifically the minty green, the blue, and the dusty rose colors. If anyone out there has ever tried these paints, let me know what you think about them, especially if you've had the paints for long enough to determine how well the colors will hold up over time. Will they fade? Happy painting, and thanks so much for watching.